Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating manuscript from an attorney named Magnus Dark. It's a text that completely flips the script on history's greatest monsters by looking at them through the cold, hard lens of the legal system. Let's just jump right into this because once you see these classic stories mapped out as actual legal briefs, I promise you're never going to look at a fairy tale or a gothic horror story the same way again. So ask yourself this: what if the supernatural villains we all know actually had documented, completely reasonable grievances that society just ignored? Miss Covenant, a senior partner in this incredibly unique law firm, really hits the nail on the head. She notes that a villain might just be someone whose side of the story we've deliberately tuned out, mostly because it's way easier than admitting we might be complicit. It really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about these classic antagonists. To wrap our heads around this wild concept of getting justice for the damned, we're going to explore two true crime-style case studies. Both of these were handled by Eternal Grievances LLP, which is a firm that specializes in what they call interdimensional litigation. Our source manuscript was penned by Magnus Dark, and get this, he actually left a soul-crushing corporate job doing pharmaceutical mergers in Manhattan to set up this firm. He takes on clients like Frankenstein's creature and Count Dracula. And the incredible part is that he isn't using magic or trying to rewrite history. He operates strictly within the bounds of the adversarial justice system to represent beings who have historically been denied adequate counsel just because of narrative bias. He is literally treating legendary monsters like everyday citizens who just need a really good lawyer. Right, so let's get into this first case because it perfectly maps on to standard workplace discrimination. We're looking at Count Vladislav Dracula suing a London real estate firm called Harker & Associates. Specifically, this is about violations of the Undead Americans with Disabilities Act. So Dracula was actually a top performer. The guy generated over £4 million in revenue for his firm. But despite that, he faced an absolute HR nightmare from colleagues who point-blank refused to accommodate his documented lethal medical conditions. His formal grievances? Well, he was scheduled for mandatory 8 a.m. daylight meetings despite a literal, fatal sunlight allergy. He also had to deal with industrial quantities of garlic mysteriously left in the shared break room, sharpened wooden tent stakes left drying on the dish rack, and he was even denied a small, sealed container of native Romanian soil that he required for religious and medical rejuvenation. When Dracula formally requested reasonable accommodations, so he didn't literally burst into flames during the workday, his boss, Jonathan Harker's actual documented response was just staggering. Harker told an employee who spontaneously combusts in sunlight to try coffee. That completely ignores the interactive process required by disability law. I mean, dismissing a lethal medical condition as a weird sleep thing is basically an HR professional's worst nightmare caught in writing. Now, this wasn't just a case of a boss being ignorant. This escalated into a severe, hostile work environment that crossed the tipping point into highly actionable legal claims. The crucial detail here is that Dracula didn't just quit. This is a textbook case of what employment lawyers call constructive discharge. Harker actually pulled Dracula aside and suggested he'd be happier working at a funeral home or maybe a 24-hour call center. He effectively forced him out by intentionally making the conditions intolerable. And under the law, creating an environment so hostile that an employee has literally no choice but to resign, that's treated exactly the same as firing someone illegally. Now, Harker's legal team tried to defend all of this by claiming a coworker's wooden stakes in the break room were just harmless camping gear. But let's be real for a second. Normal tent stakes are metal. They're blunt. The stakes in that break room were wooden and sharpened to a lethal point. Bringing sharpened wooden stakes near a Romanian vampire is not a coincidence. It is a targeted, recognizable threat. It's the exact equivalent of leaving an open jar of peanut butter on the desk of an employee with a severe peanut allergy. And of course, the truth finally came out in discovery. Under oath, his coworker Jenny flat out admitted the harassment was intentional. She explicitly stated she brought the steaks and the garlic because she just wanted him to leave. She thought he was strange, he didn't fit in, and everyone was uncomfortable. Well, that sworn admission completely nukes the company's defense, proving discriminatory animus on the permanent record. Faced with that undeniable evidence, Harker & Associates had to settle. The final number? $475,000. And that included a $50,000 donation to the Undead American Legal Defense Fund, plus a formal apology, mandatory company-wide sensitivity training, and actual policy changes. At the end of the day, Dracula didn't want to ruin the company. He just wanted to be treated like a person who happens to be undead, rather than an undead thing that happens to work there. Okay, let's pivot to our second case, which completely shatters the nostalgic narrative of a classic American fairy tale. We're looking at a massive wrongful death lawsuit, the estate of Throp versus Dorothy Gale. To really grasp this case, we have to talk about strict liability. Basically, this means you are legally responsible for damages regardless of your intent, especially if you engage in ultra-hazardous activities. And let's be honest, operating an uncontrolled flying house in a supernatural storm, that is the textbook definition of an ultra-hazardous activity. It doesn't matter if you didn't mean to hurt anyone. If you keep a pet tiger and it mauls someone, you're liable. If your flying house lands on someone and crushes them, yeah, you are liable. So Elphaba Throp, who you probably know better as the Wicked Witch of the West, acted as the administratrix for her deceased sister, Nesseros. She filed a federal lawsuit against 3 key defendants. You have Dorothy Gale as the principal operator of the Flying Farmhouse. Then there's Glinda of Oz for acting as a co-conspirator and aiding in the theft of estate property without authorization. And finally, the Wizard of Oz for fraud and orchestrating a literal murder-for-hire plot against Elphaba herself.
Now, we really have to reframe how we look at the most famous shoes in cinematic history. We need to look at them through a strict, objective legal framework because they are absolutely central to this entire lawsuit.
The double standard here is just unbelievable when you shift your perspective. The fairy tale view sees magic shoes, a heroic girl, and a wicked witch. But the legal view? Nesseros had a severe disability affecting her lower limbs. Those ruby slippers were functionally her medical mobility aid. Taking them off her deceased body without estate authorization isn't some magical reward. It is felony grand larceny and the desecration of a corpse. Imagine taking a deceased person's custom wheelchair and just handing it to a teenager as a prize. The financial reality of this incident is staggering. This $5.85 million civil rights lawsuit forces us to look at the devastating toll on the Throp family. We're breaking down $2.5 million for wrongful death, $1.5 million for the theft of irreplaceable family heirlooms, $850,000 for the total destruction of a historic 4-bedroom home, and a cool $1 million for the intentional infliction of emotional distress Elphaba suffered when she arrived to find her sister crushed, while a crowd actually cheered and celebrated. Now, to be completely fair and balanced here, we have to neutrally observe the defenses offered by Dorothy's legal team. And they do offer a highly sympathetic defense. They argue the storm was an act of God, she had zero control over the house's trajectory, she accepted the shoes in good faith from an established authority figure, and above all, she was a frightened child acting under extreme duress in a foreign land. Legally speaking, that child in crisis narrative is an incredibly compelling defense strategy. But this whole legal breakdown actually brings us to the profound philosophical core of this explainer. Why does looking at stories through this rigid legal perspective matter so much? Because when you strip away the musical numbers and the magic, you're left with 2 very human experiences, and it forces us to reconsider who writes the narrative. When you put them side by side, the double standard is glaring. Both Dorothy and Elphaba were traumatized young women. Yet society instinctively offered infinite compassion and grace to Dorothy. They celebrated her as a hero and protected her at all costs. Meanwhile, Elphaba, who had literally just lost her only family member and her historic home in a freak accident, was permanently vilified, labeled wicked, and actively hunted down. And why? Simply for demanding the return of her deceased sister's stolen property. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. How often are we perfectly comfortable ignoring a victim's voice simply because it's easier than admitting we cheered for the wrong side? By forcing these legendary stories into the objective framework of a courtroom, we realize that sometimes the monsters are just people asking for reasonable accommodations, and the wicked are just the grieving asking for justice. Keep questioning the narrative, guys, and I'll see you in the next explainer.